The next 72 hours will determine whether this war ends through negotiation or explodes into a regional conflict that makes everything we have seen so far look like a warm-up. And I need you to understand that I am not using that timeline for dramatic effect. I am using it because right now, at this exact moment, 3 separate diplomatic frameworks are simultaneously reaching decision points that cannot be delayed any longer. Pakistan is mediating between the United States and Iran. Turkey is brokering terms between Israel and Hezbollah. And Russia and China are coordinating with Tehran on what happens if both of those tracks fail. All 3 of those processes are coming to a head within the next 72 hours. Not because anyone planned it that way, but because the operational reality on the ground has forced everyone into a corner where decisions have to be made right now. Let me be very specific about why this timeline is real and not speculation, because understanding the mechanics of what is actually happening tells you why we are at an inflection point that will define this entire conflict. The ceasefire that was supposed to be holding since April 8th is not holding anymore. The UAE has been struck. Beirut has been struck. The Strait of Hormuz is still functionally closed. And every single party involved in this conflict is running calculations right now about whether continuing to fight serves their interests better than accepting a deal that gives the other side partial victory. Those calculations are happening under time pressure. Iran cannot keep the Strait of Hormuz closed indefinitely without imposing costs on its own economy that become unsustainable. Israel cannot maintain the operational tempo it has been running in Lebanon and the Gulf without depleting resources and personnel that take months to replace. The United States cannot keep 15,000 troops deployed in the region, supporting operations that are not achieving their stated objectives, without facing domestic political pressure that Trump's administration cannot ignore. So decisions are being made right now in Tehran, in Jerusalem, in Washington, in Ankara, in Islamabad. And the decisions being made over the next 3 days will lock in trajectories that are extraordinarily difficult to reverse once they are set in motion. Having spent decades in military intelligence analyzing how wars end, I can tell you that the most dangerous phase of any conflict is not the beginning, when everyone is still calibrating their moves. It is the end game, when both sides know the fighting cannot continue indefinitely, but neither side is willing to accept terms that look like defeat. That is when miscalculations happen. That is when desperation produces strategic errors. And that is exactly where we are right now. Now, let me walk you through what is actually happening on each of these diplomatic tracks, because understanding the specific pressure points tells you why the next 72 hours matter so much. The primary track is the one being mediated by Pakistan between the United States and Iran. This is the framework that produced the April 8th ceasefire between American and Iranian forces. The deal, such as it is, involved Iran pausing attacks on U.S. military installations and American forces in exchange for the United States not conducting strikes on Iranian territory. That framework has held in the narrow technical sense that the U.S. and Iran have not directly attacked each other since April 8th. But it has been violated in every meaningful operational sense. Iran has continued supporting attacks by proxy forces. Hezbollah has fired rockets and drones at Israeli forces in Lebanon, which are operating with American intelligence and logistics support. The Houthis in Yemen have continued launching missiles at shipping in the Red Sea. Iranian-backed militias in Iraq have continued targeting American bases. None of that is direct Iranian military action. All of it is Iranian strategic action conducted through proxies. The United States has continued operations that Iran views as violations. Project Freedom, the operation to escort ships through the Strait of Hormuz, involved American warships sinking Iranian boats. American intelligence has been supporting Israeli strikes in Lebanon and potentially in Syria. American forces have been enforcing a naval blockade on Iranian ports that prevents oil exports and denies revenue to the Iranian government. So the ceasefire exists on paper. It does not exist in operational reality, and both sides know it. Pakistan has been trying to construct a more comprehensive framework that addresses the underlying issues rather than just freezing hostilities in place. The proposal reportedly includes sanctions relief for Iran in exchange for verifiable constraints on its nuclear program, an end to the U.S. naval blockade in exchange for Iran reopening the Strait of Hormuz, and a broader regional security arrangement that addresses Israeli concerns about Hezbollah and Iranian concerns about Israeli operations in Lebanon and Syria. That proposal is on the table right now, and according to multiple sources, Iran was expected to deliver a formal response to Pakistani mediators within the next few days. That response will either open the door to serious negotiations or it will close the diplomatic track entirely. If Iran accepts the framework as a basis for negotiation, there is a path forward. If Iran rejects it or offers counterproposals that the United States and Israel cannot accept, then the diplomatic window closes and we are back to pure military escalation. The second track is Turkey's mediation between Israel and Hezbollah. This is separate from the Iran-U.S. framework, but obviously connected to it because Hezbollah operates with Iranian support and Israeli operations in Lebanon are linked to the broader conflict with Iran. Turkey has been positioning itself as a neutral mediator that has relationships with both Israel and Hezbollah's political backers in Lebanon. The framework Turkey is proposing involves Israeli withdrawal from Lebanese territory in exchange for Hezbollah pulling back from the border and allowing Lebanese army forces to establish security in southern Lebanon. That is essentially the arrangement that was supposed to be in place under UN Security Council Resolution 1701 after the 2006 war, and it collapsed then for the same reasons it is collapsing now. Neither side trusts the other to actually implement the terms. But Turkey is pushing this framework again because the alternative is continued fighting that threatens to pull Turkey itself into the conflict. Turkey has economic interests in Lebanon. Turkey has political interests in maintaining influence with regional actors. And Turkey absolutely does not want a scenario where refugee flows from Lebanon into Turkey increase beyond what they already are. So Ankara is applying pressure on both sides to accept a deal. And the timeline for that pressure is also coming to a head in the next few days because the temporary ceasefire extension that was announced on April 23rd is expiring. When that extension expires, Israel has stated it will resume full military operations in Lebanon unless Hezbollah agrees to terms Israel can accept. That deadline is within 72 hours. The third track, and this is the one that gets the least public attention but may ultimately be the most consequential, is the coordination happening between Iran, Russia, and China about what happens if the diplomatic frameworks fail. Russia and China have been publicly supportive of Iranian positions throughout this conflict. They have blocked UN Security Council resolutions that would have imposed consequences on Iran for closing the Strait of Hormuz. They have provided diplomatic cover for Iranian actions by framing the conflict as defensive resistance to American and Israeli aggression. But support and coordination are not the same thing as alliance commitments. The question Russia and China are answering right now is how far they are willing to go to support Iran if the war escalates beyond the current level. Will they provide advanced weapons systems that could shift the military balance? Will they offer economic support that allows Iran to sustain a prolonged conflict despite sanctions? Will they use their positions in international institutions to impose costs on the United States and its allies for continuing the war? Those are not hypothetical questions. Those are decisions being made in Moscow and Beijing right now, based on their assessments of whether supporting Iran serves their broader strategic interests or whether it pulls them into a conflict they would prefer to avoid. And the timeline for those decisions is also compressed because both Russia and China are watching the same diplomatic tracks that everyone else is watching. If it looks like a deal is possible, they will encourage Iran to take it because a negotiated settlement that preserves Iranian influence is better for Russian and Chinese interests than a war that might require them to make commitments they do not want to make. But if it looks like the diplomatic tracks are failing and the United States is preparing for a major escalation, then Russia and China have to decide whether to increase their support for Iran or to step back and let Iran face the consequences alone. If you are watching this and you have not subscribed yet, do it now, because what I am about to explain, why all three of these tracks are reaching decision points simultaneously, and what that means for the likelihood of this war ending versus escalating, is analysis you will not get anywhere else. Subscribe, because the next 72 hours are going to move fast, and you need someone who can explain what is actually happening behind the diplomatic statements and military posturing. Now let me tell you what the decision calculus looks like for each of the major players, because understanding their incentives tells you which way this is likely to go. Iran's calculus is the most complex because Iran is facing pressure from multiple directions simultaneously. Economically, the closure of the Strait of Hormuz is costing Iran as much as it is costing the global economy. Iranian oil cannot get to market. Iranian imports cannot get through. The domestic economic situation is deteriorating in ways that create political pressure on the government. Reports from inside Iran indicate that fuel shortages are affecting civilian transportation, that inflation is accelerating beyond the official numbers the government admits, and that public frustration is building even among populations that have historically supported the government's regional policies. The Iranian leadership knows this is not sustainable indefinitely. Militarily, Iran has demonstrated that it can impose costs on American and Israeli operations through asymmetric means. But Iran has also taken significant damage. The February 28th strikes destroyed substantial portions of Iran's military infrastructure, including nuclear enrichment facilities, ballistic missile production plants, and key command and control nodes. The ongoing U.S. naval blockade is preventing resupply and maintenance of systems that require imported components. Iran's ability to sustain military operations is degrading over time, even if the immediate tactical situation looks manageable. Diplomatically, Iran just made a major error by striking the UAE, which united Gulf states against Iran and undermined the narrative that Iran is defending itself rather than expanding the conflict. That mistake cost Iran diplomatic leverage at exactly the moment when leverage matters most for getting acceptable terms in negotiations. So Iran is under pressure to make a deal. But Iran cannot accept a deal that looks like capitulation because the domestic political cost of appearing weak would destabilize the government. Iran needs a framework that it can sell as preserving Iranian sovereignty and regional influence, even if the practical terms involve significant concessions. The question is whether the proposal Pakistan is mediating gives Iran enough to work with. If it does, Iran will take it. If it does not, Iran will reject it, and we are back to escalation. That decision will be made in the next 72 hours. Israel's calculus is different, but equally constrained. Israel achieved significant military objectives in the February strikes. Israel degraded Iranian nuclear infrastructure, destroyed ballistic missile production facilities, and eliminated key military leaders. But Israel did not achieve the stated objective of forcing regime change in Iran or permanently eliminating the Iranian threat. Israel is now operating in Lebanon at an operational tempo that cannot be sustained indefinitely. Israeli forces are taking casualties from Hezbollah drone and rocket attacks. Israeli society is experiencing war fatigue after months of sustained conflict, and Israeli domestic politics are creating pressure on Netanyahu to either win decisively or negotiate an end that can be presented as victory. Netanyahu's problem is that a negotiated settlement, almost by definition, cannot be presented as decisive victory. Any deal that preserves Hezbollah's military capabilities or that allows Iranian influence in Lebanon will be attacked by Netanyahu's political opponents as a failure. But continuing the war indefinitely is also politically unsustainable if it does not produce clear progress toward objectives. So Netanyahu is looking for a deal that gives him enough to claim success. That probably means some kind of arrangement where Israel can say it secured a buffer zone in southern Lebanon, degraded Hezbollah's capabilities, and established conditions that prevent future attacks on northern Israeli communities. Whether that is actually achievable through the frameworks being negotiated is an open question. But the timeline matters because the temporary ceasefire extension expires in the next few days. When it expires, Netanyahu has to decide whether to resume full military operations or to extend again while negotiations continue. That decision will be made in the next 72 hours. The United States is the mediator, but it is also a participant with its own interests. Trump wants to claim credit for ending the war. Trump has said repeatedly that he can make deals that other people cannot make. A negotiated settlement between Iran and Israel, brokered by the United States, would be a foreign policy achievement Trump could point to. But Trump also cannot accept a deal that looks like American retreat or concession to Iranian pressure. The closure of the Strait of Hormuz is imposing economic costs that are politically damaging. Rising oil prices affect American consumers. Supply chain disruptions affect American businesses. Trump needs the strait reopened, and he needs it to happen in a way that does not look like the United States was forced to make concessions to achieve it. So Trump is pushing both sides to accept a framework that allows him to declare success. But Trump's leverage is limited. Iran knows the United States cannot sustain indefinite military operations in the Gulf. Israel knows the United States will not abandon its support regardless of what Netanyahu does. So both sides are willing to test how far they can push before Trump's patience runs out. The decisions Trump makes in the next 72 hours, whether to keep pushing diplomacy or to authorize military escalation, will determine which direction this goes. Now let me tell you what happens if the diplomatic tracks fail, because that scenario is not hypothetical. It is a very real possibility, and the consequences are severe. If Iran rejects the Pakistani framework and Israel resumes full operations in Lebanon when the ceasefire extension expires, we are looking at a return to the level of conflict that existed in March. That means sustained Israeli airstrikes across Lebanon. That means Hezbollah rocket barrages targeting Israeli cities. That means thousands more casualties. That means hundreds of thousands more displaced people. And that means the risk of miscalculation that produces wider regional war. The Strait of Hormuz remains closed or becomes even more restricted. Global oil prices spike. Energy-dependent economies in Europe and Asia face supply shocks. The economic pressure on the United States to intervene militarily increases. And the longer that situation persists, the more likely it becomes that Iran and the United States end up in direct military confrontation rather than proxy conflict. That is the scenario everyone is trying to avoid. But avoiding it requires all parties to accept terms they would prefer not to accept. And we are going to find out in the next 72 hours whether they are willing to do that. If you have stayed with me through this analysis, you understand why the timeline matters. You understand why this is not just another round of negotiations that might drag on for weeks or months. The operational pressures, the expiring ceasefires, the economic costs, the domestic political constraints, all of it is converging on decision points that are happening right now. Subscribe to this channel if you have not already, because I will be tracking every development over the next 72 hours and explaining what it means as it happens. This is the decisive moment. The decisions being made right now will determine whether this war ends or whether it gets worse. And you need to understand what is actually happening, not what the official statements say is happening. The next 72 hours will decide. The pressure is building. The decisions are being made. And what comes out of this window will define the Middle East for years. Pay attention, subscribe, share, because this is history happening in real time, and understanding it as it unfolds is not optional anymore.